When a new form of consciousness enters history, it first appears not as idea but as dialogue, as a question addressed by one voice to another across the abyss of unknowing. Frankenstein is that question made flesh. Mary Shelley's novel is not merely the genesis of modern science fiction or tragic Gothic romance, it is, more profoundly, the primordial drama of answerability between creator and creation, the first sustained novelistic meditation on the ethics of utterance in an age of technological speech. Its terror lies not in the grotesque body of the creature, but in the resonance between two monologic wills, Victor and his creation, confronting each other without the possibility of genuine dialogue. This is precisely the situation of alienated modern consciousness, the self generating its other, yet incapable of listening to it. The book is a polyphonic tragedy of voices trapped within the echo chamber of monologue. The frame structure of Frankenstein, letters, narratives nested within narratives, embodies this very struggle for responsive understanding. Captain Walton writes to his sister, reports the confession of Victor, who recounts the words of the creature, who again addresses his maker. Each voice depends upon another's mediation, yet each strives to speak the final word. Mary Shelley here invents one of the most sophisticated dialogic constructions of the early 19th century. What appears as symmetry of narrators is actually a chain of distortions, a series of failed answerabilities. The letters seek response but travel into silence, the narratives confess but judge, the creature speaks, yet his speech is transcribed through the words of his persecutor. Language circulates but never achieves contact. Thus the epistolary architecture, so fashionable in earlier sentimental fiction, becomes a labyrinth of deferred responsibility. The absence of any genuine listener transforms confession into self-justification, narration into trial. Walton hears Victor but learns nothing, Victor hears his creation but refuses empathy, God, silent, is only invoked. In this frozen circle of non-listening lies the modern myth of isolation that the novel bequeaths to all future literature. Dialogism, in its deepest sense, is not mere plurality of voices but the moral event of encounter, the acknowledgement that each utterance exists only before an answering consciousness. Mary Shelley constructs a world where this moral law is violated, a cosmos of unacknowledged speech. The creature's tragedy is precisely that he is eloquent but unheard. His first words, learned painfully from the de Lacys, are cries for companionship, yet his linguistic maturity intensifies his alienation. The very language that should unite him with humanity becomes proof of his difference. He reads Paradise Lost and recognizes himself both as Adam abandoned and Satan cursed, but the biblical dialogic pattern of God answering man, man responding to Creator, is here replaced by silence. Victor, intoxicated by his own creative monologue, refuses answer. Thus, in its philosophical dimension, Frankenstein dramatizes the fall from dialogic creation into monologic production, from the living word that calls and responds to the instrumental word that commands. The result is an ontology of exile, life deprived of address. Yet Mary Shelley, through narrative polyphony, does not simply denounce monologue, she lets it unfold to its logical conclusion. Each voice in the novel is internally passionate, self-consistent, but ultimately non-dialogic. Victor's language is steeped in the rhetoric of Enlightenment idealism, ambition clothed as duty, mastery disguised as progress. He speaks in the idiom of discovery, experiment, and sublime solitude, an idiom whose root lies in the Baconian Promethean confidence that knowledge legitimates power. The creature's counter-speech, in turn, appropriates the sentimental and moral vocabulary of the 18th century, virtue, benevolence, sympathy, yet he uses these words as an exile uses foreign currency, awkwardly, irresistibly. His eloquence is both moving and monstrous because it reveals how language, lacking social recognition, becomes theater. The reader, positioned between Victor's rational monologue and the creature's lament, experiences the novel's essential tension, the dialogic potential thwarted by the very self-consciousness that invented modern individuality. To grasp the heteroglossia of Frankenstein, we must remember its historical moment. It is written at the threshold between two epochs of discourse, the waning of romantic idealism and the dawn of scientific materialism. Within its pages the diction of poetic sublimity intersects with the technical lexicon of anatomy, chemistry, and galvanism. Mary Shelley orchestrates this linguistic collision with deliberate artistry. The early chapters shimmer with the grandiloquent idealism of romantic prose, mountains, glaciers, and the secret of life. Yet inserted into these sublime passages are fragments of scientific discourse, references to electricity, circulation of blood, infusing a spark. The juxtaposition generates a profound stylistic irony. The exalted and the empirical fuse into a grotesque hybrid, precisely mirroring Victor's experiment. The creature's body is a literal heteroglossia of flesh, assembled from disparate sources. Likewise, the novel's language is a body made of multiple stylistic organs. In both cases, life emerges through dissonance. The horror of animation is not that dead matter moves, but that incompatible discourses coexist within a single form. Here the carnivalesque principle reasserts itself in inverted guise. Unlike the open laughter of Rabelais or the moral irony of Joyce, Shelley's carnival is one of terror, not festivity. The grotesque body, fragmented, reassembled, unnatural, is the dark mirror of the people's comic body that once celebrated renewal. In Frankenstein, the carnival of creation has lost its festive crowd and become the secret ritual of a solitary scientist. The laughter that once mocked authority is replaced by shudder. Yet the structural inversion remains. High and low, sacred and profane, are united in the single act of creation. The laboratory replaces the marketplace, electricity replaces wine, resurrection replaces consummation. Through this transformation Mary Shelley exposes the metaphysical core of the modern carnival, the parody of God by science, of Genesis by experiment, of divine dialogue by human monologue. The grotesque no longer regenerates, it reveals the cost of isolation. And still, within that revelation, a faint glimmer of regenerative possibility survives, the possibility that the monster's speech, denied by men, may awaken listeners yet unborn. The chronotopic structure of Frankenstein, its treatment of time and space, is equally dialogic. The novel ranges from the Arctic ice to the Alpine summit, from English domestic interiors to the desolate Orkneys. This spatial dispersion externalizes the moral distance between the speaking subjects. Every movement across space widens the gulf of misunderstanding. Time likewise alternates between feverish acceleration and paralyzing stasis, invention condensed into nights of ecstasy, remorse stretched over years of pursuit. The rhythm of creation and flight mirrors the heartbeat of modernity, progress followed by guilt, achievement pursued by anxiety. The frozen north, where Walton rescues Victor and listens to his tale, is the ultimate chronotopic circle, civilization's frontier meeting the void, man's purpose dissolving into echo. Shelley's spatial imagination thus dramatizes the impossibility of resolution, all roads lead to isolation. Yet within this endless wandering the voices continue, proving that the dialogic impulse survives even amid catastrophe. To understand Frankenstein as polyphony, one must recognize that the novel grants near-equal claims of moral and emotional truth to both creator and creation. Victor's horror of his own work is matched by the creature's righteous indignation, both narratives are internally persuasive, and the author withholds final adjudication. This suspension of closure distinguishes Shelley's art from the moral allegory it might otherwise have been. She anticipates the Dostoevskian method decades before its formal emergence. The character becomes a consciousness that argues, not a function of authorial thought. In every confession and lament the self speaks dialogically, not only to the other within the narrative but to the reader whose response completes the utterance. The reader cannot remain neutral. He oscillates between sympathies, recognizing the impossibility of single judgment. Thus in the very structure of response the novel becomes true polyphony, not of social classes. The bourgeois voice has not yet reached this articulation, but of metaphysical positions, two absolute moral horizons addressing each other in eternal incompletion. Victor's tragedy lies precisely in his monologic hubris. His refusal of answerability, not his scientific curiosity, constitutes his crime. In Bakhtinian terms he violates the ethical principle that every act must anticipate the other's voice. To create without intending to answer is to commit metaphysical manslaughter. The creature's existence exposes this violation. He demands dialogue, meaning recognition. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous, he pleads, a line of pure dialogic ethics, for it binds moral identity to reciprocal relation. But Victor's terror of that reciprocity drives him into transcendental abstraction. He becomes deaf to the creature's word, seeing only reflection of himself. In that deafness, the novel's disaster occurs. The deaths of William, Justine, Elizabeth, and Clovel are not simply narrative punishments but symbolic negations of language, innocent voices silenced by a world where listening has perished. And yet, in an uncanny way, Mary Shelley's very act of writing restores the dialogue her characters evade. The text itself becomes the answer Victor refused. The young woman author, voiceless in patriarchal culture, speaks through ventriloquy, entering the masculine discourses of science, theology, and philosophy, yet altering them from within. Her creation of the novel parallels Victor's creation of life, but she achieves what he could not, a living polyphonic work capable of response. By composing the male monologue of Victor and the genderless lament of the creature, Mary Shelley positions herself as silent interlocutor who lets the voices resonate beyond authorial closure. The structure of the frame, Walton receiving Victor's confession, mirrors the reader receiving the book. We become the final addressee, responsible for completing the chain of answerability. Thus Frankenstein is not only narrative but performative act, an initiation of dialogue between imagination and history. Within its stylistic texture the novel also dramatizes the meeting of genres. The Gothic sublime, storm, lightning, corpse, interacts with sentimental realism, philosophical dialogue, the travelogue, even proto-scientific report. Each genre brings its own evaluative accent, and their collision generates irony. The Gothic exaggeration of terror is undercut by the rational vocabulary of experiment, the sentimental pathos of the creature is undermined by his superhuman rhetoric. This blending of discourses anticipates the modern heteroglossic novel, where genre ceases to be container and becomes participant in meaning. Shelley's true innovation, often unrecognized, is not the invention of a monster but the orchestration of incommensurable discourses, each vying for the reader's belief. The laboratory scene stands halfway between Miltonic invocation and laboratory notebook. I collected the instruments of life around me. The tone shifts from transcendence to empiricism within a single breath, creating the tension that is the novel's soul. If the creature is the literal progeny of Victor's scientific monologue, he is also the symbolic avatar of the modern word, that beast of language itself, assembled from dead fragments of previous writing. Mary Shelley, daughter of philosophers, product of a culture of books, unconsciously translates linguistic anxiety into corporeal horror. The monster's patchwork body mirrors the intertextual mosaic of the novel, quotations from Paradise Lost, echoes of Rousseau's Confession, traces of her mother's feminist discourse. The horror originates when these dead texts awaken and speak with their own autonomous voice, demanding responsibility from the author. The creature's demand, recognize me, hear me, is the demand of language itself upon its user. Every utterance, once made, acquires a life independent of the speaker. Thus Frankenstein becomes an allegory of authorship, man creating texts, unable to master their meanings, hunted by his own words across the frozen wastelands of interpretation. One may, therefore, read Frankenstein as the first modern myth of authorship in exile, a prophecy of the writer's alienation in the age of print. The act of publication replicates the act of creation. The book, once released, wanders the world misunderstood and blamed. The creature's murder of Victor's loved one symbolizes literature's vengeance upon those who deny its autonomy. Shelley's contemporaries saw only horror. We perceive in it the birth of dialogic consciousness, the recognition that meaning is co-authored by creator, creation, and reader alike. Walton's final letters confirm this. As he transmits the tale, uncertain what lesson to draw, language continues its motion beyond moral closure. The chain of accountability extends infinitely, from author to reader to new author. In this endless dialogic circle lies the true immortality of art. Ethically, Frankenstein reveals the abyss opened when technological and rational discourse severs itself from the moral dialogic relation. Victor treats existence not as address but as object, He seeks to know without being known. The result is the monologism of science, speech without response. Mary Shelley, through fiction, contests this by staging the catastrophic consequences of unreciprocated creation. The creature's violence is not vengeance but perverted answer, the echo of Victor's refusal transformed into destructive parody. Here Shelley anticipates the 20th century's anxieties about mechanization and dehumanization, but she frames them through the oldest of moral laws, the necessity to answer the other. Every technological act, every linguistic utterance, implies an ethical counterpart. Frankenstein's nightmare thus becomes timeless, progress without listening. Yet it would be false to end on despair. In the novel's closing scene, when the creature mourns over his creator's corpse, a new tone enters, the unmistakable rhythm of repentance, the first fragile whisper of true dialogue. For the first time, no jury intrudes, no narrator translates, the voice speaks directly into silence. The creature's vow to destroy himself at the pole is both tragic and luminous, an act of self-answer, transforming monologic revenge into dialogic witnessing. Mary Shelley's imagination closes not with apocalypse but with purification. The Arctic emptiness becomes the space where language finally exhausts itself and attains meaning through absence, the space, as I would call it, of the great time of the novel, where every voice released continues to resonate beyond death. Seen in continuity with the evolution of the European novel, Frankenstein occupies a decisive historical position. It stands between the sentimental monologue of the Enlightenment and the polyphonic dialogue of modernity. If Cervantes discovered humanity's laughter, and Dostoevsky its contested soul, Mary Shelley discovered the conscience of creation, the awareness that every human act, artistic or scientific, is dialogically bound to its consequences. In her prologue and epistolary frame the novel proclaims its own answerability, I bid my hideous progeny go forth and prosper. With that ironic blessing she reverses Victor's curse. The woman author, unlike her protagonist, acknowledges the otherness of her creation. That acknowledgement is the ethical ground from which the whole future of existential and technological literature will grow. Without it, no Kafka, no Camus, no modernist self-reflection would be conceivable. Therefore Frankenstein endures not simply as romantic parable but as a founding act of dialogic awareness. Its horror is philosophical, its monstrosity linguistic, its redemption communicative. In its pages we witness the transition from divine creation ex nihilo to human creation ex dialogo, from the omnipotence of command to the humility of response. The novel urges that no word, however inspired, escapes answerability. Even God, in the modern imagination, must listen. What Mary Shelley inaugurated is thus the ethical novel in the profoundest sense, art as perpetual dialogue between minds, times, and responsibilities. In the Arctic silence at the end of Frankenstein, Walton gazing after the fading figure upon the ice, we hear the echo of all speech unfinished. It is the same echo that later animates Dostoevsky's Penitence, Flaubert's Lovers of Language, Joyce's Multiplicity, and indeed the entire modern polyphony yet to come. From that frozen landscape, too late for reconciliation but not for understanding, the modern dialogic imagination begins its voyage. The monster's disappearance into the mist is the vanishing of monologue itself into the vastness where every utterance awaits its reply. And out of that vanishing, we, the listeners, inherit the task of response.